Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to our Google Plus Hangout, airing live from the American Heart Association Scientific Sessions. I'm Katty Gray, contributing editor for DailyRx.com, and I'll be your moderator for today's panel. Today, we're here to talk about knowing your risk for heart disease, including about the latest studies, the details of that from the scientific session. So let's get started with our distinguished members of the panel. Our leading guest, of course, is Dr. Donna Arnett. She's president of the Heart Association, and she will introduce the other two guests for the afternoon, and we'll fire away with questions from there. We'll take your questions toward the end of the session. Dr. Arnett?
Well, thank you, Katty. It's a delight to be here, and I'm joined by two illustrious guests, Dr. Amit Kara from UT Southwestern and Dr. Penny Chris-Etherton from Pennsylvania.
And absolutely, one other reminder, those of you who are tuned in, we are tweeting live at hashtag AHA14. Before we get into the latest news, let's just start with a few basics. If y'all would lay out for us what remains some of the continuing risks for heart disease, elevated blood pressure, that type of thing, and give us a sense of where we are in terms of managing and controlling those as a general public.
Well, Katty, I'll lead off by saying that heart disease and stroke are the #1 and #4 killers of Americans. So these two diseases remain a really important area of concern for the U.S. public. The good news is that 80% of cardiovascular disease and stroke is preventable by following a very simple prescription. We call it here at the American Heart Association Life Simple 7. And really, it's knowing your numbers for your blood pressure, your cholesterol, and your glucose levels, and keeping those within the normal limits, and really adhering to 4 behaviors that can maintain your health throughout your lifetime and prevent cardiovascular disease. And that's being a non-smoker, having a healthy weight, eating a good diet, and exercising regularly. And with those activities, you can reduce your risk of heart disease, stroke, and not only those two, but cancer and diabetes as well.
Sure. And what are we making? What sort of headway are we making in terms of applying the lives of everyday people? How far are we going in that direction?
Well, we're starting to see bends in the needle in the areas of obesity with some policies and activities that have been taking place in schools. And so I'll ask Penny, what do you think we're doing in terms of bending the curve here?
Well, I think that we've made a lot of progress in meeting some of the metrics for our cardio protection. But I think in terms of diet, and nutrition is my area of expertise, we really have a long way to go still.
And Amit, what do you think?
You know, I'll add to that. I think just we've changed the conversation away from just thinking about lowering death, but how do we improve cardiovascular health in our population, and really looking population-wide across these different metrics and changing the way we think about cardiovascular.
If y'all would just dig a little deeper into that, if there is some distance to go in terms of helping people to transform their eating habits, what would be that distance? And are there, across the sort of demographic of people who live in this country, if there are particular areas of challenge, where would those areas be and with whom?
So let me just lead off, and then I'll ask our nutrition expert from Penn State to answer that question as well. But, you know, really, diet is we at the American Heart Association don't recommend a specific diet. We really ask you to work with your healthcare provider. But certainly we do know that diets rich in fruits and vegetables and low in sodium and filled with the good kind of fats, and I'm sure Penny will talk about. You know, those are diets that we know, in addition to lowering caloric intake if you're overweight and trying to lose weight, are the healthiest ways to do that.
The American Heart Association recommends a dietary pattern that's rich in fruits and vegetables, whole grains, lean proteins, it's low in sodium, low in added sugars, and it contains skim milk, low-fat dairy products, and lean protein sources. So in terms of how Americans are doing, we fall way short in meeting those particular recommendations. And we're eating way, way, way too much added sugar and way too much sodium, as well as saturated fat is high too. In order to decreased risk of heart disease through a healthful diet.
And Patty, you asked about the demographic, and something that we hear a lot is that people are concerned that these diets rich in fruits and vegetables are hard to maintain on a low budget. So would either of you like to comment on the ability to do that?
Yeah, I'd like to just jump in and say that if people choose seasonal fruits and vegetables, it's a lot easier to follow current recommendations. You don't have to break a budget meeting these current recommendations. And I think just understanding how to shop wisely is one way to do this.
I also want to bring up societal context. When one component, sodium, which we've been so focused on, we have to remember that much of it is in things that we eat, where bread is one of the major contributors cumulatively to sodium. So, a lot of work with the American Heart Association, working with industry, working with our partners to try to reduce sodium so that the easy choice is easier to make in terms of reducing sodium.
One interesting aspect of this week's research has been on trans fat consumption and its link to poor memory or to memory loss, if phrased another way, among working age adults. So the question is this: precisely who are those working age adults? What does it cost them in the workplace? And is there any discussion of how to get employers on the bandwagon and to see that association perhaps between productivity at work, etc.?
Well, the study that was done is very interesting. There were 1,000 men studied. The researchers looked at their trans fat intake, and basically those that had the highest trans fat intake had the worst memory recall on a word memory recall test. And so they recalled 10% fewer words compared with people who had a low trans fat intake. And in fact, for every 1 gram of trans fat intake, there was about a 1-word memory loss, which is pretty significant. And we've known for a long time trans fats are really bad for heart disease risk, and then diabetes as well. And now we're learning that they're equally bad for the brain.
Is there any discussion at the benefits for employers to be aware of these associations and how to have a sort of good eating campaigns in their own workplaces?
So, Amit, do you want to talk about that from a policy perspective and what we are doing with workplace wellness?
Sure. Workplace wellness is incredibly important. As you know, the vast majority of adults are in working environments, and so the ability to impact people where they work has an incredible impact on health. Now, specifically with trans fats, a lot of things have happened of late in the last few years. One is the mandatory labeling, so people can now actually have an idea of what they're consuming. And in a few cities, we have trans fat bans where people essentially are not allowed to add them in restaurants. But that's not far-reaching or far enough. And I think when you add what we'd already known about cardiovascular disease, lipids, and heart disease and obesity, and now that we begin to think about cognitive effects, perhaps we'll have more of a groundswell about doing more from a policy perspective.
And could I just ask, Penny, so if you were an employer, how would you get rid of what's an easy way to get rid of trans fat in the workplace?
Well, just require trans fat-free foods in every eating establishment.
And where do you get these trans fats from?
Well, trans fats are in a lot of different foods, although they're mainly in processed foods. The food industry has made fabulous progress in decreasing trans fats. And so we used to consume about 2.5% of our calories from trans fat. And now, if you look at the CDC website, we're way down to less than 1%. Americans are consuming about 0.6% of their calories from trans fats. However, in looking at that website, what you see is that with a number of foods, there are variable amounts of trans fats. So there are still margarines out there that are high in trans fats. A lot of them don't have trans fat. Another major source of trans fat is microwave popcorn. So I think it's really important for employers to check the food labels of different foods and make sure that they do contain 0 grams of trans fat when they're putting them in eating establishments and vending machines.
Sure. If we could change course just a tad. So if we look at household eating habits, some of this week's new research also linked childhood obesity to obesity among pregnant women. Explore that territory a tad and sort of give some correctives and easy ways to address that, or ways of addressing that.
Sure, it's really a fascinating study, and as we think about cardiovascular disease, we're looking along the life course. What this study did from the Framingham Heart Study population, they took about 879 individuals, and starting in the 1970s, and looked back at their parents, basically their mother, and was their mother overweight or obese during pregnancy. And what they found, in fact, that if the mother was overweight or obese, that the offspring then, the children, as they grew up over their lifetime, had a significantly increased risk of having heart attack and cardiovascular disease death. So, we don't usually think about that. We think about the child themselves and how they grow up, or as they get older, the risk factors. Now realizing the risk factor is actually whether your mother was overweight or obese, when you were in utero. So that's really looking, even extending the life course and thinking about the risk of cardiovascular disease.
Is that obesity a function of eating habits, of sort of handed down eating habits from mother to child, or what's the in utero effect?
Yeah, I'll comment and see if my colleagues want to add to that, but there's probably two ways or a few different ways, interpretations of this. One could be shared environment, that if the mother, eats an unhealthy pattern, or there's obesity in the mother, that environmental sharing, or the habit, if you will, would be shared. There's a little bit of biologic data that if the mother is obese, that something happens in utero to the child development. It can affect certain organs or hormone levels that may have effects later on in life. So it's not just a habit, but there may actually be some biology that changes for the baby as they're developing.
Well, my field's in genetics, and we've certainly recognized that there are epigenetic factors that get upregulated. They're called methylation. These factors get methylated, and then it causes gene expression long-term across the lifespan. So it could be that you're getting these early biologic changes in utero. The good thing about epigenetic changes is they are reversible. So there is good news about adopting a healthy lifestyle, even if you've had an obese mother.
And how the process of reversing, what kind of work perhaps is being done clinically, doctor to mother, to sort of get that message across?
We're very early in the epigenetics field in that domain, so I can say that there was evidence from earlier studies, some done in Europe, not mother to child, but just in adults, that the Mediterranean diet, for instance, could reverse some of the methylation that had occurred in some key regulating enzymes.
And what about stress and its role in heart disease, in blood pressure, perhaps hormonal effects that tie into weight and overweight?
Well, that's a tough one. No, stress is a very hard thing to measure, and yet everyone just universally knows they are stressed. So we do know that when you induce stress in clinical settings, in a study that was presented here at the American Heart Association, they induced stress by having someone read a speech in front of a group of people they didn't know about a stressful situation. And for some people that may be very stressful, and indeed it was associated with greater myocardial ischemia or reduced perfusion blood flow and cardiac imaging that can talk about. But what's interesting is we do know that stress, when we can measure it under these standardized ways, is definitely associated with increased blood pressure, as you mentioned, and there can be long-term detrimental effects on your ability to cope and how that affects your diet and other parts of your life.
Yeah, I think that's important that, there's two facets. One is the physiologic effects of stress itself. It may affect the blood vessels, cortisol, other hormonal aspects, increasing the adrenaline levels, but the flip side is how it affects your behaviors. And I'm sure Dr. Cecily can talk about that, but how that changes the way people sort of behave and healthful behaviors.
Yeah, and I think stress can also cause overeating, even undereating, but also lack of physical activity, just lethargy, and just being very sedentary.
So this new research also had explored the gender divide, or the differences in gender, and part of what was presented this week indicated that women with stable coronary heart disease were more likely than men to have reduced blood flow because of heightened emotional stress. Would y'all talk about that some?
I'll start again, and I will say it's a really fascinating study, and partly by the way they did it. So this investigator had previously shown years ago that when young women have a heart attack, they have a much higher risk of dying from it than men. So young women are sort of a unique group. They don't get heart disease as often, and so better understanding why they're developing it and why they're worse risk of dying. What they did was they took these women and men, there are about 530 people, and they essentially gave them two types of a stress test. One was a walking stress test, the usual way, and the other was, as mentioned, they had to give a public speech about some uncomfortable thing in their life. And so we call that physiologic stress. And then they actually measured blood flow in the heart with a nuclear tracer that they injected, a standard stress test that we do, looking at blood flow. And essentially what they found in both these women and men that had heart disease, the exercise stress test was the same amount of reduced blood flow. But in women with the physiologic stress, the public speaking, they had a much greater reduction in blood flow than men, and that was exacerbated in young women. So if they're under 55, it was threefold reduction in the blood flow of the heart. And I think that really speaks to how men and women are different, particularly young women, and how the physiology of stress may affect men and women.
Yeah, one word of caution about that study, and not that the study, caution about the study, but it was in women with coronary disease. So they were already diseased. So whether or not this would reflect women who are healthy and have normal cardiac physiology, we don't know.
What were the triggers? Just the sort of plainly, what things tended, the things that they were talking about, set them off? The sort of common everyday things, perhaps.
You know, I don't know that we know the details of the test, but I will say that if you think about it, what was reported, they basically asked them themselves to think about something that's stressful. So, you know, and stress is sometimes internal. It's what is stressful to you. So they had to recall something that they thought was stressful and then talk about it publicly. So that's not, you know, if you think about the scheme of stress, that probably is not as extreme as some other things, and nevertheless, it still caused reduction in blood flow. So it just goes to tell you that even sort of day-to-day stressors may have an impact on our physiology of blood flow.
There was also news this week linking chronic asthma to heart attack, which is perhaps an association that the average person would never make. Is there something that the millions of people in this country who have asthma ought to be concerned about? And tell us about that.
Certainly, Katty. There were two different studies of asthma presented here at the American Heart Association. One used data from a very well-known study called the multi-ethnic subclinical atherosclerosis study. That's a mouthful, but that's a long-term cardiovascular study. And in that study, they looked at three groups: those who had what they called active asthma. That is, they were symptomatic and they were taking medications for their asthma. And they compared them to the group that reported asthma but was not being treated, and then finally a group with no asthma. And what they found that if you had active asthma, that is asthma that required medication, that you were about 70% more likely to have a heart attack over a 10-year period of follow-up. So what that says is that there may be something about the process of having active asthma that is either correlated with myocardial infarction or heart attack, and it may be mediated through a common process called inflammation, or it could be some other mechanism. Now, the second study was done in the Mayo Clinic, and there they compared active asthma cases, again, those that were treated as cases, compared to asthmatics that did not require treatment, and they too noted about a 60% increase in cardiovascular risks from active asthma. So it says that those who have asthma may want to talk about to their doctor or healthcare provider about whether or not they have cardiovascular risk factors that require attention.
In the simplest lay terms, would you explain inflammation, its role in asthma, and perhaps what might be some anti-inflammatory remedies, whether through food or medicine or whatnot?
Okay, sure. You know, inflammation, if you think about cutting yourself and getting an infection, you know, we have inflammatory processes that get upregulated internally. Another very common cause of inflammation that leads to inflammation throughout our body is having periodontal disease. So we've had a long recognition that periodontal disease is linked to cardiovascular disease, probably through this inflammation. So you get any kind of infection in your system. If you get atherosclerosis, you get an upregulation of these inflammatory parameters. They're called CRP, C-reactive protein is one measure. There are other biochemical measures. So essentially, it's an upregulation of our body's defense mechanisms, probably initially to help fight the infection, and then they get persistently upregulated.
And what we know is that healthy lifestyle practices can decrease inflammation, blunt the inflammatory response, and quicken resolution. So, a healthy diet, physical activity, getting enough sleep, and avoiding stress, and keeping all those risk factors in check can really help quell inflammation.
For those of us who were, I'm sorry, go on, please.
This is an asthma study. We also don't know as well in terms of, remember these people are mainly a bit older, but about asthma control over a lifetime and whether that can suppress some inflammation over your lifetime. So part of that is certainly lifestyle incredibly important, and what we don't know is what about asthma treatment and management.
For those of us who did not have the good pleasure of being there with you this week, what is the level of energy there, the optimism, the challenges, sort of what's the climate? And if you all three would address that, where do we go from here? Sort of our last weigh-in of this chat. Well, I love this meeting because there's so much enthusiasm. It's just a very vibrant meeting with a lot of very, very, very high-level science and top-level interest in just learning everything that people can so that when they get back home, they can translate this into practices. It's very exciting.
I would agree. This is probably the best few days out of the year in many ways from a scientific perspective, and probably one of the big challenges is taking all this excitement and information and digesting it. You need several weeks to digest and make sense out of all the things that we learned here, but very exciting.
I would say the level of excitement's really off the scale, Caddy. The American Heart Association brings science to life, and that's really what this meeting is about. We bring the best new evidence for not only how to treat patients with heart failure, with arrhythmias, with heart attacks, with strokes, but also we bring messages to the consumers about how they can prevent cardiovascular disease and stroke for themselves and their family.
Thank you so much for your time and your science and your answers. I'm sure they'll all be good to be put to good use. And thank you to those of you who chimed in on this live chat. And have a good afternoon, everyone.